Hey Jim, to date I really haven't heard from you, although I did hear from Willie Jessup, and in typical Willie fashion he responded to the last video with, for lack of a better term, the usual verbal diarrhea of misrepresentations and allegations that he is known for. You said at the Meet the Candidates last week that you take him at his word, that you still find Willie to be a credible source of information. So let's run through some of the things that Willie said, comments that he made on that video, and further that discussion and see just how credible he really is. I'm going to quote some of the items that he said as best I can. Some of this is very difficult to read, and then give a response on it. So let's start with this first one. As you well know, Jim Barlow resigned from being on the UEP board because of fraud, unquote. So Jim, you kindly provided on your website, you updated it after my last video. You didn't change anything, but you added a few things. You didn't change any of the questions that you had. You didn't change any of the incorrect assertions that you had, but you did add onto it your resignation letter. Now, I did find it interesting that your letter is not dated. It does not have a date of the resignation. But based on looking up news articles, it must have happened somewhere around 2014 or before that, because that's when the news articles came out that quoted some of your resignation letter. In 2014, the board, the UEP board, had not even been established. And so I think it should be very, very clear that, and Jim, I know that you've never directly said that you served as a trustee, but Willie is making that assertion, and it's an incorrect one. And where you want to put truth out to the people, you should probably correct the fact that he is saying that you resigned from the trust board. The trust board meaning the trustee board. You never served as a trustee. You were never on that board. You served on a housing committee for the UEP Trust, a housing committee before the trust board was formed that was helping Bruce in housing decisions. That is it. I think that should be corrected, and to have that assertion out there on Willie's part is completely incorrect. That is not true. So number two, this is a quote from Willie. Quote, "When I was asked by the court judge Lindbergh to serve on the UEP board, I disclosed to her that I wanted to buy land more than my home and my office, and disclosed it as a conflict of interest. She agreed. So when I see board members transferring or selling land to themselves, family members, that is exactly why I am not on the UEP board, and those doing it are fraud." Unquote. You know, I've heard that. I've heard Willie say that enough times now that I almost think that he believes it. But let's give a little bit of backstory and context to the trustee selection. So in 2013 and into 2014, Judge Lindbergh asked for those interested in serving as trustees to put in an application. Those applications were then vetted through the Utah AG, the Arizona AG. There were financial statements that had to be given and disclosed. It was a pretty rigorous process of vetting, and then it moved from there. The list was narrowed down, and Judge Lindbergh met with the majority of the candidates in one group meeting, and then she began meeting individually after that as she narrowed the selection down even further, one-on-one with the candidates, as she moved towards making the final selection of the first 5 trustees that would serve on the board. So it's interesting, there was one, as this process was moving through and nearing the completion, Judge Lindbergh put a call to the public. And what this was is she asked for public comment on, she put out the list of potential candidates. These were not those who were that had the ultimate selection. This was a broader list of more than 5. And she wanted to hear from the public their thoughts, positive or negative, on the candidates. Well, there was one candidate that received an overwhelming, my understanding, received an overwhelming number of responses back to the judge. And these were not positive responses. These were more along the lines of, I can't believe that you would even consider letting this individual be on the trust board or to serve on the trust board. So this particular individual also had a history with Judge Lindbergh, had been in her court many times, and in fact had called the judge the devil to her face. That hardly seems like a good way to build a positive working relationship and rapport with a judge. But be that what it is, this particular candidate I'm referring to was you, Willie Jessup. It was you. And you wonder why you weren't selected. Maybe it had something to do with the fact that you had a history in the community, the people knew you, and when the judge asked what those within the community thought, they responded. Maybe that's why you were not selected. You'd never turned down being on the board. You were not selected to be a trustee. You were a candidate for trustee, and that's it. And as far as this claim that you disclosed that you wanted to purchase additional information and the judge said that's a conflict, that's entirely possible. The judge would have said purchasing property from the trust is a potential conflict. But knowing Judge Lindbergh, she probably also would have pointed you to the trust document in Section 5, subsection 1, which deals specifically with that very item and how to work the parameters to if you ever were to apply and want a distribution, further distributions or sales out of the trust, how to disclose that, the proper method of recusal. There is no fraud involved in that. That is completely proper if you follow the right process. That does not exclude anyone from being a trustee. And to make that claim over and over and over again is just outright wrong. And it's obvious that anyone who would make that claim, that claim hasn't read and does not understand the trust document. I encourage everyone to read the trust document that wants an understanding of how the trust operates. But bottom line, Willie, you were never asked to be a trustee. You were one of the candidates to be a trustee. I think that should be crystal clear to everyone. You didn't turn down the opportunity. It was never offered to you. Okay. When I was hired, this is quote, when I was hired to defend the UEP Trust from her, quote unquote, Alyssa lawsuit, it was going to expose that Jeff Jethro was on both sides of the litigation, costing the assets of the trust to be liquidated for both its defense and its plaintiffs. Being in the same actors, I'm not exactly sure what that means, costing the trust millions of dollars and people their homes. Arnold knew this. Interesting. That's a very interesting assertion there from Willie. So the first time I ever spoke with Willie about the lawsuit, it was referred to as the MJ lawsuit. The Lisa Wall lawsuit was referred to as the MJ lawsuit. The first time I ever spoke to Willie about this lawsuit was May 6th of 2016. That was the day after the lawsuit was settled. So to make that claim that I knew anything coming from Willie before that is absolutely incorrect and not true. Also, let's deal with this when I was hired to defend the UEP Trust from her Alyssa lawsuit. You know, it was the day after the settlement, I received a call from Willie, and this was a lengthy phone call. It lasted roughly from, I believe, Nephi, Utah, all the way to St. George. And the essence of the lawsuit, to distill it down, Willie was upset that he had not been involved in the settlement or in the potential of it going to trial. And why was he upset? Why did he even care? And during this call, the claim was made, well, Willie claimed, I was hired by the trust. I was put on retainer for the trust. And I asked him who, and he wouldn't give me a straight answer. That's because it's not true. And to understand that, I'm going to have to give some backstory on where this is even coming from. But throughout this phone call, what Willie was really upset with had nothing to do with Jeff, had nothing to do with Jethro. It was the fact that he wanted this case to go to trial because he had a significant amount of evidence that he believed would be very beneficial at trial, and he wanted to be paid for that evidence and to present it at trial. Keep that in mind. He wanted to be paid. This can be problematic, as I'm going to explain. So, this is 2016. In 2014, and I can give the date here, May 6th, 2014, Willie entered into an agreement with the trust. This was an agreement that Willie would receive something of value from the trust and he would provide something of value to the trust. So what did Willie provide to the trust? What item of value was provided to the trust? There were two items. The first item was that Willie would provide to the trust information that was helpful to the trust in their ongoing litigation. And let me read from this the settlement with Willie that the trust entered into in 2014. So, buyer's cooperation, this is Section 8.2 of this agreement. As an essential covenant required by seller to enter into this agreement and to consummate the transaction described herein, buyer hereby agrees, buyer being Willie Jessup, to cooperate with seller, seller being the UEP Trust, in every reasonable and timely manner, supplying accurate and truthful information and documents that buyer, the UEP Trust, in good faith believes to be accurate and truthful for seller's consideration and possible use in seller's defense in all pending litigation. All pending litigation. And then it goes on and says, including that certain matter entitled MJ, aka Elisa Wall, versus Warren Jeffs et al., pending in the 3rd Judicial District Court in Salt Lake City, Utah, and it gives the civil case number. Seller being the UEP Trust, and I may have misspoke earlier when I said buyer, seller being the UEP Trust agrees to pay all of buyer's reasonable actual out-of-pocket expenses associated with buyers, that being Willie's, compliance with obligations contained in this paragraph as approved in advance by seller. What does all that mean? This means in 2014, the trust received something of value from Willie. That was his cooperation in the ongoing litigation. He had already been paid. He had already been paid for this information, yet here he was calling me up the day after the settlement and wanting to be paid again. He was upset that he had not been paid again. And as I go through this list, he makes this claim several other times, that he wants to be paid for something that he was already paid for. And it's interesting. Willie's wanting to be paid for information that, if you really think about it, he never paid for in the first place. It was the FLDS people that funded the attorneys that did all the research to bring this information forth. He just happened to be in possession of it and wanted to capitalize on the fact that he had something of value to the trust. Right? So that was one thing that Willie gave to the trust in this 2014 agreement. What was the other item? The other item was that Willie agreed to transfer back to the trust water rights that he had transferred out of the trust. And you're going like, what? Yeah, really. Willie had created a shell corporation named Southside Irrigation LLC and transferred the surface water rights, the irrigation water rights, out of Southside Irrigation into this shell corporation. And when the trust became aware of that and was about to pursue litigation to get those water assets transferred back into the trust, Willie agreed to cooperate and transfer them back, but he wanted something of value for doing that. It boggles the mind. So if you want to do the right thing and you realize I shouldn't have taken something, you would put it back. But that's not the case here. He wanted something of value for transferring the water back into the trust. The water that had been fraudulently removed from the trust, these water rights. Talk about shenanigans. So Willie agreed to and did transfer these back. So now let's talk about what Willie received from the trust for helping to transfer the water rights back and agreeing to help with ongoing litigation. So he received his house out of the trust. Well, that seems reasonable. And he received the acreage next to his house. He had animal pens and he had gardens, so the lots next to his house. And all of this he received at a sum. And keep in mind, as long as the trust has been distributing property out of the trust, to my knowledge, with the possible exception of Richard Holm, everyone has been required by the judge to pay 15 cents a square foot for the dirt. 15 cents a square foot, roughly $6,500 an acre, to remove land out of the trust. In this case, the property that the house is on and the adjacent lots, in this agreement, they were transferred out of the trust, $2,500 for all of it, $2,500. What was the second item? The second item of value that Willie received from the trust in consideration for his cooperation. 200 acres of we refer to as the gap property. So the 200 acre gap property and the improvements and the buildings and everything that were out there. And what was the cost to Willie on that acquisition? Nothing. It was zero. In this agreement, he had that property transferred to him at a cost of $0.00. So keep in mind, those are the items Willie received, and in exchange he agreed to give to the trust cooperation in their ongoing litigation, and also to make sure, and he had at that point, he had transferred back the water rights that he had transferred out of the trust, he transferred those back in. So keep that in mind. He was not hired by the trust. He was not an attorney for the trust. He is not an attorney. He cannot do legal representation. And to make the claim that he was hired by the trust is absolutely false. But regardless, that's his claim. That is the claim that he's been putting out there. So let's go back to where we were on this. So when, quoting Willie, when I was hired to defend the UEP Trust from a Lisa lawsuit, it was going to expose Jeff Jethro was on both sides of the litigation and costing the trust assets to be liquidated for both its defense and plaintiffs. Isn't that fascinating? Well, number one, he wasn't hired, but if he actually had information that this was happening, which it was not, but if he had that information, why didn't he ever bring it forth before this? This would have been something that probably the AG should have known about. Is it possible that it's just not true? I think it's a high likelihood of that. So this long phone call that I had with Willie after the settlement, that's the first time that we had talked. And he was upset because he wanted to be paid for this information that he had. Information that he'd already received significant value out of the trust for. He wanted to double dip. He wanted to be paid again. He didn't bring up Jethro in that conversation. So really, trying to make that claim, it doesn't hold up. And beyond that, throughout the entire conversation, until nearly the end, I did not disclose to Willie that it was myself and Shirley Draper that had been tasked with the duty from the trustees to go and facilitate the settlement and to be the trust representatives in the negotiations. I let him know that at the very end of this conversation. And miraculously, within a day, his story had changed. Interesting how that works, isn't it? So, and I'll get to that a little bit later. Let's go on to another one of the quotes from what Willie wrote on my Facebook on the last video. Quote, "As it was becoming extremely obvious there was going to be millions of dollars paid out over a fraud that Jeff and Jethro was helping Lisa Wall facilitate, Arnold and Shirley did a late night negotiation to pay your millions of dollars, not made public, to keep the fraud from being exposed, and myself and Bill Walker were excused, with the case settled with a big payout to the fraud from the case, and they settled the case with those suing it and defending it, the same parties." This is a direct quote, and The things that Willie writes are just so hard to read, but I get the essence of what he's saying, and I think most people listening do too. So let's begin with this late night negotiation. The mediation started at 9 o'clock in the morning in Salt Lake City. That's not in another hemisphere. So no, it did not start. It was not in the afternoon. It did not start in the evening. It was not negotiated at night. It started in the morning and ran all day until into the evening. And so there was myself and Shirley. We were representing the trust. We had our attorneys there, our legal counsel. Elisa Wall was there with her legal counsel. Oh, and one other important entity was there, and that was the Utah AG. David Wolf from the Utah AG participated in this negotiation and the ultimate settlement. So, Willie, you want to go to the AG? Do it, please. They were a party to this, and they had skin in the game, and it was because of the Utah AG that helped to push this over the finish line and actually got a settlement. So, yeah. You want to go talk to them about the Elisa Wall settlement? I would encourage that. Maybe you would become a little bit more educated. Because it was not something that happened in the middle of the night. It happened in the daytime. And the undisclosed amount? No, it was widely disclosed. We'd hardly left the building before the news reports were out there of what the settlement was. And so that leads into my next quote. You gave millions of dollars under the table. Go transparent with it. Tell us what you paid them out of people losing their homes and property. Okay. And this is pulled right out of news reports. Even though I know the amounts, this was pulled right out of news reports. It is public knowledge. It is out there. It is not a secret. The case was settled for $2.75 million, and of that, $1.5 million was cash. The rest was property. Now, keep in mind, anytime in a civil case, when an attorney takes the case on, there is an agreement that they get a percentage of the final settlement. I have no idea what Elisa Wall's attorney's agreement happened to be in this case. The typical amount is roughly a third, 33%. So if you take 33% of the total 2.75, and then you look at the cash amount that was in the settlement, at most, Elisa would have ended up with about $500,000 in cash. Best case. Not millions. Not millions at all. And all of this is in public record. It is not hidden. I just don't get it. I really don't. How some of these accusations can even be stood up as being plausible. But there it was. Now you know the truth. What's being represented here is not correct on Willie's side. And let me also say, if Willie's really concerned about the people paying the costs of legal expenses and defense, he's the last person in the world that should be. I can think of nearly 23 different lawsuits that were filed that Willie was either a party to or involved with while he was in the FLDS church and a part of the group that was corralling the attorneys and basically making life for the trust for Wyson and the attorneys miserable. So 23 different cases that overlapped with the trust. So while the FLDS were being, and I was there, we were being told, brethren, bow your backs, the attorneys need to be paid. Money was going out of the people. I mean, it was just flowing to these attorneys, millions of dollars. And on the other hand, the trust was trying to defend against these lawsuits, liquidating property to pay their attorneys to defend the trust. Millions of dollars right there. So Willie's the last one that should talk about money leaving the people in defense of anything. Good grief. That cost this people millions of dollars out of the trust and just out of the people in general. Both sides. Serious money that was squandered on these lawsuits. Next one. Jethro went with Elisa to Baltimore, Maryland, to help draft the lawsuit against the UEP, and then you try to cover it up. That's an interesting claim. So this claim, the first time I heard this claim was 2 days after the settlement. 2 days. So Willie came to the UEP Trust board meeting, demanded to be seen by the trustees. Don Timpson, being board president at that time, agreed to. And that was when Willie came in and said, hey, you guys, you've been misled by Jethro. I believe that he may have a stake in wanting this to have gone to settlement and withheld information from you trustees, that if you would have known about this information, you wouldn't have gone forward with the settlement. You would have taken it to trial because it would have been a slam dunk. You know, Willie had said the same thing the day before to me without having Jethro as the bad person, just saying, hey, there's information that you didn't know about. And every single item that was brought up, I already knew about, the trustees knew about. The information that he had, the evidence that he had, that he believed was so compelling that we would have gone to trial, we were already aware of, had considered, and in consultation with legal counsel, decided, you know what? It's still best to settle this case. The best path forward would be to settle. Well, there he was in the boardroom, lambasting Jethro, saying that he had withheld this information. And through the process of withholding information, had pushed this towards a settlement so that he could receive something back out of it. That's the first time I ever heard this allegation. An interesting allegation, and again, even in the boardroom when pressed, Willie couldn't come up with any information, any evidence that the UEP Trust Board was not already aware of. Strike one. Now let's talk about this claim of Jethro going to Baltimore with Elisa. That's true. They traveled together to Baltimore. A couple of inconvenient truths, though. This happened in 2005. That was before Jethro even worked for the trust. Another thing to keep in mind. Yes, Elisa did go meet with Joanne Suter in Baltimore. Joanne's not the one that ended up following this through and filing suit. That was another law firm. It happened at a later date, and initially it didn't include the trust. The initial case was against Warren Jeffs, and it was after the case was being pushed forward that Roger Hull added the trust, because they realized that, you know, Warren Jeffs himself really doesn't have any asset or money in his name. And so they started looking for other things that overlapped with Warren Jeffs that maybe they could get some value out of. So as far as Jethro going and starting this lawsuit, and the only evidence of this was a trip to Baltimore that he happened to take with Elisa, that doesn't even rise to the level of circumstantial evidence, because nothing came forth or happened after that. It's just a ridiculous claim. But there it is. Willie's putting it out there, and it's absolutely incorrect and false and easily provable as being incorrect. All right, let's talk about this next one. We repeatedly go to your meetings and you try to shut us down when we ask for this accountability. Remember? We repeatedly asked the trustees to not have the same family that was suing the UEP and allegedly defending it. Quote unquote, Jeff, Jethro, Elisa. That's the end of the quote. That's interesting to make that claim. It really is. Because both public meetings and the private meetings, I can only think of one other time that this even came up. And that was in 2019. So in August of 2019, at that point, I was board president. And Willie had gone into the UEP office and was talking to Jeff, demanding to be put on the agenda and have a time slot scheduled that he could meet with the trustees. And Jeff had informed him that no, he couldn't just do that. That was the board president decision whether or not to put him on. So they got me on the phone. This was August 19th of 2019. So they got me on the phone, and Willie took the phone and walked out so that he wasn't in the presence of Jeff, and said, hey, you know, there is a lot of corruption and inside dealing, and Jeff and Jethro are corrupt and crooked. And by this time he'd kind of fleshed out his story of Jeff, Jethro, Elisa. I was like, okay, so that's what you want to meet with the board? can you send me any evidence of your claims? And he said, well, I can't send you an email. I don't want to memorialize this. Interesting, right? Because I have a habit of writing down in my planner, when I have conversations such as this, key points that were said in the conversation. So I have this written down. I have this documented in my day planner, what was said. Instead, Willie said, I would like to meet with you in person and give you the 30-minute version. All right, I agreed. And so this was on a Monday, August 19th, on Monday. That Saturday, I went out to his Gap property, and myself and Ray Jessup Jr., we both went out there for the 30-minute version, which ended up taking 3 hours before I finally said, okay, we've heard enough of the allegations. And 2 key things. I agreed that I would look into Willie's concerns that some of his closings were taking longer than he thought they should. I agreed. I will look into that and see if there's anything going on that is unprofessional or in any way trying to antagonize or make life miserable for Willie. I agreed to that. The other item is that I told Willie at that time, I am not going to put you on the schedule until you have some evidence of your allegations. You have to have evidence. Evidence is required anytime you make an allegation for it to move forward. I can't investigate allegations unless there's some evidence. Well, fast forward 1 week. No evidence. We're in a private meeting as trustees, and Willie just kind of saunters on in, wants to sit down and start talking to the trustees. That's not how it works, and he was invited to leave. I invited him to leave. He did not have an appointment. He was not on my agenda. He was not scheduled for a time slot. Let him know that he was welcome to come to the public meeting, and this is the public meeting that he refers to. So Willie showed up at the public meeting, and he brought his, for lack of a better term, his posse. He brought individuals, I guess, for moral support. And when I opened the meeting up to public questions, of course he stood up. And for about 10 minutes, started going on with the same allegations. No evidence, hadn't brought any evidence, but these allegations of wrongdoing specifically targeted towards Jeff and Jethro. After about 10 minutes, I stopped him. And I turned to the rest of the public audience that was there and said, is this something that you guys want to continue to listen to and hear? And the public audience said, no, not at all. You know, there are individuals, when they walk into a room or stand up to talk, you want to hear what they have to say. They have incredible credibility. You know that what they say is the truth. They have a reputation for that. And as a general rule, the public wants to hear from them. Willie's definitely not one of those individuals. And in this case, the public was sick of hearing from him. So after the public said, no, we don't want to continue to hear, I turned back to Willie and said, Willie, do you have any evidence for these allegations? Once again, he had no evidence. And so he says he was shut down. So if requiring evidence before I pursue any kind of an investigation is shutting someone down, sure, guilty as charged. But you will find, if you go to any law enforcement agency, if you go to the AG, what are they going to require? Oh, evidence. Yeah, you have to have evidence. If you come in with allegations, especially ones that are false, you can be charged with false reporting. That is a crime. And you wonder why Willie has made these allegations and even spouted off many times, well, I'm going to go to law enforcement. I'm going to go to the AG. All these horrible things are going to happen. They never have. Why is that? Oh, probably because they're not true and there is no evidence. And he knows that. So his claiming that he was shut down, no, he wasn't shut down. He had a request put to him to provide evidence. And if he ever had, we would have continued to look into it. To date, I have seen nothing from him. Nothing. And then he also said that, repeatedly go to this, he shut us down. So this is another quote from that. So then you quit having them, referring to the public meetings, and went virtual. Interesting, but not true. because the meeting that he attended was the public meeting in September of 2019. Just so happens that October follows September, right? We had an October public meeting that he could have attended, a November public meeting. We skipped December because of the holidays. Oh, and then we had a January of 2020 meeting, a February, March, and April. All of those were public meetings. He could have attended any of those. And if he would have brought in any kind of credible information that had any kind of supporting documentation on it, he would have been listened to. He didn't show up. He didn't repeatedly come. He didn't try. Didn't hear anything from him through that whole time. So no, we didn't go virtual. And even when we did go virtual because of COVID, there was still a platform and a way for anyone who had questions to let them be heard by the trustees, and we would answer them. So that claim, not true. Not at all true. So I have gone through, I have listed some of the claims that Willie has made, and these are ones that just came out of what he put on my Facebook. And even that, just like his story with Jeff and Jethro, it has evolved from what he posted Friday night, his first postings, to what is there now. It's evolved. I think somebody may have informed him that what he put up very first, especially, could be Exhibit A in a defamation suit, and that's certainly not taken off the table, just so that you know. And because of screenshots and being able to backtrack as far as what has been put on, even if it's edited by those who put it on, it's still there. Some of the very inflammatory items that were there, you can still look them up. But regardless, the stories that Willie puts out, they change, they evolve. And as soon as you bring up evidence that disproves, he pivots and tries something else. And he can make up crap faster than anyone I have ever seen. It is incredible to watch. But it's just that. It's not true. It's nonsense. And I've had to deal with it, and I've heard it for years. And it's just amazing, his ability to do that. And it has worked in the past, because by being able to come up with these stories and mislead and have allegations, he has somehow successfully received a tremendous amount of value out of the trust and out of other organizations in this process. So I guess it's effective. It doesn't make it right, but it is effective. And you may wonder, why is he so upset with the trust? Well, I think it's because the trust said, we're done. We're not listening to this kind of nonsense. The gravy train stops. Let's go back to this agreement that he signed in 2014. He continually came into the trustees and said, hey, there were ongoing agreements that had never been fulfilled from Wyson, and I want additional property. I want things out of the trust. Both Willie and his brother Travis met with me, and I believe this was in the beginning of 2017. He was wanting to get the south yard out of the trust, and represented to me that there were ongoing commitments from Wyson that hadn't been fulfilled. It just so happens this 2014 agreement had what's called an integration clause. And for anyone who doesn't speak legalese, basically what that is it wraps everything up with a nice tidy bow and says, this is a clean line. Everything that was before this, you cannot claim it as valid as far as a claim against anyone or entity. And I'm going to read the integration clause out of that agreement that Willie signed back in 2014, and it is accordingly, buyer does hereby, buyer being Willie, unconditionally release and discharge seller, its fiduciaries, agents, attorneys, employees, and any of its and its affiliated entities from any and all claims, liabilities, obligations, attorney fees, actions, and causes of action. Basically, that wraps everything up and says, by you receiving from the trust what you're getting, you have no further claims on anything. And yet here he was again. He had made that phone call right after the settlement with Elisa, wanting to be paid for something that he'd already received significant value for, wanting to be paid for the evidence that he had that he thought could be useful in that case. After that, he came in and represented that there were ongoing commitments that had not been fulfilled, even though he'd already signed an agreement saying that everything was taken care of. You know, it's just interesting to me. So I really didn't hear from Willie after this 2019 public meeting until basically 1 year later. received a phone call from him. And this was September 23rd of 2020. Phone call, he'd left me a voicemail. I returned his phone call at roughly, I think it was 6:30 in the evening. And he was at his daughter's ball game at the time, but stepped out and took the call. And I took down notes from that phone call, as I often do. Interesting notes. Willie had been into the city and had been making claims that he had owned the water and that there were commitments from the trust that he had demanded in transferring these water rights to the city, that the water was supposed to go to the city, that it had been obligated in some way to the city. I called him out on that when in this phone call. So notes from the phone call, quote, Willie claims he never criticized the trustees, because we'd also talked about that. Also said he never claimed to own the water, just that he was asked to do some transfers and maybe sell it to raise money. Willie claims that I have never done anything unethical. Interesting, right? Because he is now saying that he told me years ago about this ridiculous accusation he's got against Jeff and Jethro, and that I tried to cover it up. And yet 1 year ago, just over a year ago, phone call, he's saying, oh, no. I've never said you did anything unethical. And yet 1 year previous was the first time in public meeting when I shut him down by saying you have to provide evidence. He turned on me. That was the first time that he'd ever turned on me. And said, oh, I didn't realize that you were part of this conspiracy and this cover-up, and kind of went after me and my father. Interesting, right? Some people's memories just really aren't the best, maybe. And I'll talk about that in a minute. So Willie, where was I? Willie claims that I have never done anything unethical, even though that is what he said in public meeting a year ago. He does feel owed something on MJ, that's the Elisa Wall case, and that is why he should get the South Yard. So even at that point, he was still trying to double dip on that information and cooperation as far as information to the trust concerning litigation, specifically on the Elisa Wall case. He still wanted to get something again, even after receiving his house and property next to it for $2,500 and the Gap property for nothing. That wasn't enough. He was back for more. And that is why he felt entitled to receive the South Yard out of the trust. Crazy, right? Continuing on with my notes. I asked if he had a copy of the 2014 agreement. He said no. I let him know Mark James, that's Willie's attorney, did. And the conversation was pointless until he reviewed and understood it. So basically, he kept going in circles, and anyone who's ever had a conversation with Willie knows just exactly how that goes. You try to answer one point, and it moves. It's like nailing Jello to a wall. And so finally, I was a little bit frustrated and said, look, we can't continue this conversation until you've read what you already committed to. Well, first, he couldn't even remember ever having that commitment. And then he claims that he didn't, if he had committed that, it wasn't something that really stuck out or that he knew about. And so that's why I insisted, go talk to your attorney. He's got a copy of what you agreed to. And really, to this day, I don't know if Willie just has amnesia or selective amnesia and forgets these things, or, is it possible that he's just incompetent and doesn't understand the things that he is signing and agreeing to? I mean, I'm looking at a copy of this agreement from 2014. It has his name, his signature, and yet he does not remember it. Or is it possible that there's a certain level of dishonesty there? And any of these, they're not mutually exclusive. It could be a combination. But regardless, to make an agreement where one receives such enormous value out of the trust, to then come back and think that you're entitled to more, it just absolutely astounded me. And for what it's worth, Willie never called me again after that. I have never heard from Willie since then. I guess if that's shutting him down, telling him to go talk to his attorney and understand what he has already committed to, I say that's a fair criticism against me if that's what he's referring to. Because yeah, you should acknowledge what has already been agreed to and follow along with it, and not try to come back and ask for more value out of the trust for something that you've already been paid. It's like being paid 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 times for the same thing. That's not right. That's not fair to the rest of the beneficiary class. And it's just not right in general to do that. So, all that said, and I've just pulled from what Willie said on my Facebook, commenting on the video. With all that said, Jim, we come back to where I ended on my last video. Do you really find Willie to be a credible source of information? Do you? And really, I mean, does having your campaigns solely financed by Travis Jessup, Willie's brother and business partner in the subdivision that they're building in Utah, you realize that is the largest, that those two are the largest single landholder in Hilldale? Having them as the sole contributor to your campaign, do you think that might cause you to lose a little objectivity as far as the credibility here? And the bottom line still for me, Jim, has this ever really been your campaign? Or has it always been Willie's?